Hi everyone, my name is Nuno Mota and I will be presenting our work on nudging for equitable donations, jointly done with Abhijnan, Chakraborty and Krishna Gummadi from the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems, Biega from Microsoft Research, and Hoda Heidari from Carnegie Mellon University. Our work focuses on educational altruism as a means to mitigate social inequities in the US's public schooling, and how nudging can actually be utilized to its advantage. For those of you unfamiliar with public schooling in the US, it is a widely accessible and free of charge schooling system, and to function it mainly relies on three sources of funding. Federal and state funding represent nationwide and state-specific contributions, and the remainder of funding stems from local property taxes. To clarify the latter, the same way that the whole country can be subdivided into states, each state can then be broken down into multiple schooling districts that have legal boundaries separating them. Any property then that pertains to a certain district will then contribute to its public schools by paying taxes. If we now look at funding in districts with varying poverty levels, we see that state and federal sources seem to allocate more funds to higher poverty districts. However, if we look at the funding coming from local property taxes, we observe the exact opposite trend. Not only that, but the difference in funding is so steep that the latter outweighs all other sources of funding, and leads to poorer districts getting less funding than wealthier districts. So now we need to think about how we can mitigate these funding inequities. There are many different attempts being made, for instance in redefining school district boundaries, but this process is lengthy and requires a substantial amount of political effort. As such, this funding necessity gave rise to online educational charities that facilitate charitable giving, such as Digital Wish, Adopt a Classroom, and DonorShoes, which is the one platform we selected for our studies. While it is debatable whether these platforms can ever fully address existing inequities, we wanted to investigate whether online donations were effective in mitigating them. In other words, if they drive more funding to poorly funded schools. If we take a look at the amount of requests made through DonorShoes, we observe that, maybe unsurprisingly, more requests are submitted by poorer schools. However, if we again look at received funds, we still observe less funds going to those same schools. So despite these platforms' best interest and efforts, and the plethora of requests from those in need, somehow the trend is not being reversed, which feels counterintuitive in a charitable giving scenario. Somehow donors are donating more to moderate poverty schools rather than higher poverty ones. So we hypothesize at this point that this skew in donations can be attributed to what is called a choice architecture. If you visit DonorShoes, you will be presented with a multitude of filters, search bars, and school-made requests, and there is a substantial amount of work in behavioral economics that underlines the importance of the context in which people make decisions, known as a choice architecture, which sometimes is even more relevant than the options themselves, in this case, the prevalence of requests from high poverty schools. It could be that the website is facilitating the observed donation tendencies. So how do we actually measure the effect of a choice architecture? In our study, we designed active experiments and provided participants with real-time mirrors of DonorShoes, tempered with nudges. If choice architecture is the context in which we make decisions, one can understand nudging as specific interventions within that context. Also, we make a distinction between two kinds of nudges: overt nudges, which trigger conscious responses on our users, and covert nudges, which may trigger unconscious responses. To illustrate our experimental setup, our overt nudge was introducing an explicit school poverty label alongside each request on the platform. On the other hand, our covert nudge involved silently changing the request's default ranking order. So how effective were our interventions? Well, we know that more requests exist from highest poverty schools, and our control group, which visited a non-tempered version of DonorShoes, still showcased more donations towards moderate poverty. When explicitly shown a poverty label, however, our participants immediately shift donations towards highest poverty schools, an effect that is even more visible in our covert nudge experiment. Overall, we know that public school funding inequities exist, but are hard to counteract. We also know that educational charities address funding needs, but potentially in a non-equitable manner, and that nudging can be an effective tool in tackling this problem and is generally accepted to preserve users' freedom of choice, as options are neither removed nor made significantly harder to access. There is but one last comment in our study surrounding this issue, however. After each experiment, all users were requested to fill in a survey reporting which features mattered more to them while donating. If we compare our control group with both of our experiments, the most noticeable difference is when users are explicitly shown a poverty label. However, they don't seem to report any significant difference when the ranking is silently changed. Even though these are preliminary results, it is interesting to note that our overt nudge seemed to raise awareness of poverty level much more than our covert nudge, contrary to how effective these were in actually driving donations towards higher poverty schools. For a more detailed discussion surrounding this topic, kindly read our paper, and thank you very much for listening.